Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei on CGTN, reporting live from the APEC meeting in Da Nang, Vietnam. Coming up on today's program, President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump delivered contrasting speeches at the APEC CEO Summit. Xi advocating globalization, Trump preaching America first. Can APEC members achieve multilateral cooperation without the U.S.? I speak exclusively with the Filipino Secretary of Trade and Industry to find out how his country is conducting regional integration. And we begin today's program in central Vietnam, where the APEC CEO meeting has wrapped up in the city of Da Nang. Both Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump have delivered speeches to an assembly of business leaders, entrepreneurs. It comes ahead of the Saturday's meeting of the Asia-Pacific leaders. The two presidents outlined their visions for the future of global trade. Before our discussion, take a look at this first.
The final day of the APEC CEO meeting, just a day after the two leaders wrapped up a face-to-face meeting in Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump have delivered speeches in the city of Da Nang. President Xi Jinping told a gathering that the world's economic recovery was restoring confidence and securing globalization's future.
开放带来进步，封闭必然落后.
Openness brings progress, while self-seclusion leaves one behind. We, the Asian Pacific economies, know this too well from our own development experiences. We should put in place a regional cooperation framework that ensures consultation among equals, wide participation and shared benefits. We should build an open Asia-Pacific economy and promote a trade and investment liberalization facilitation. We should make globalization more open, inclusive and balanced, so it can benefit different countries and people of different social groups. We should proactively adapt to the evolving international division of labor and actively reshape the global value chain so as to upgrade our economies and get stronger. We should support the multilateral trading regime and practice open regionalism to allow developing members to benefit from more international trade and investment.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump told the APEC CEO summit he will no longer allow other countries to take advantage of America on trade.
From this day forward, we will compete on a fair and equal basis. We are not going to let the United States be taken advantage of anymore. I am always going to put America first, the same way that I expect all of you in this room to put your countries first.
The 21 APEC leaders will hold their main meeting Saturday and will look to make progress on regional integration, with or without the support of the United States.
For more on the APEC meeting, we are joined in our Beijing studio by Li Cheng, Director and Senior Fellow at the John Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Also joining us in Beijing, we have Teng Jianqun, Director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies in Washington, D.C., the United States. We have Adam Polson, President of the Peterson Institute. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to have all of you with us on this quite significant day. In fact, let me just say a little bit. In the background, I'm sitting here in the International Media Center here in Da Nang. In the background, the sound of the gala dinner for all the APEC economic leaders. Having said that, though, during the speeches given by the two presidents, it was not much beautiful melody, at least not matching with one another. Dr. Li, what do you make of those two quite different speeches?
Well, as an American, and actually I'm a little bit embarrassed that Xi Jinping touches all the right buttons, talk about openness, talk about inclusiveness, talk about green development, and basically talk about cooperation in Asia Pacific. But in contrast, American president, which previously served as the leader of global economy, and talk about the American first, blame some of the other countries about on the trade issues. Of course, he does not refer to China because in China he just visited. He said we should not blame China. But again, he delivered some of the good messages, but also you cannot miss the point. he talked about more like countries should have emphasized its own country, which is really missed the big point, missed the very nature of our time is economic globalization. Whether you like it or do not like it, it will be the defining feature of the global economy.
Mr. Poulsen, I would assume, though, that President Trump understands very well the audience that he was speaking to. That is the people that's embracing globalization, regionalization. That's why they come to the APEC CEO Summit. But he insisting on deliver those messages. Who do you think those messages are targeting at? And eventually, what should be the results and ramifications back at home in Washington for him?
Well, I unfortunately think the message he's delivering, despite what he claims about America first, is America afraid and alone. It's a terrible message, even from the macho, trying to be tough attitude that President Trump affects. He just makes it sound like the U.S. takes no credit for all the things that the U.S. built over the last 70 years, and the U.S. is afraid to compete. So it's whining about rules. It's also incredibly short-sighted. You and your viewers all know this. You said, who's the audience? I think it's two audiences. First, I think it's the very angry people who voted for Trump, particularly the white, rural voters, the less educated voters in the U.S. They don't really understand trade or care that much, but they like hearing their president attack other countries, and that he's playing to. And the final thing is, I think he's playing to his own self. It unfortunately seems that one of the few things in which he has deep conviction is this idea that trade deals and economic trade more broadly should be thought about like his bad real estate deals. They're one-shot deals. You bully people, you get the best thing you can, and you evade the rules where you want. This is a shameful day for America, and as the previous speaker said, this creates a lot of room for China to do good or ill.
Well, I guess President Xi are making his remarks not just for any PR effect, but rather China are really clinging to those ideas. That's what he said, at least when it comes to structural reform and opening up. Mr. Teng, next year, 2018, will be the 40th anniversary of China's reform opening up. Is this going to be already the preview, what Xi Jinping said today, of what's likely to happen next year and probably the years to come?
Yeah, actually, after the 19th CPC Congress, I'm sure everybody will be interested in the future of China, especially the recent years in the development gave us a very clear-cut roadmap for the international community to understand what China is going to do and what China will go. This is a very important time. So, during his speech this time, I think he gave a long description on the roadmap of the CPC, and also gave a very clear-cut roadmap for the development of China in the future. And I think this is a very important occasion for China to give the Chinese attitude toward the development not only in China but also in the region, in politics, in economy, and in security. So this is a very clear-cut signal that China will continue its reform and China will continue its open up.
I see. Dr. Li, you and I was talking about the Davos that was in fact witnessed one of those very important speeches given by Chinese President Xi Jinping. The world community was reacting in a very strong way, and this seems to be a repetition of that, but probably more on a regional platform.
Absolutely.
What do you say?
Absolutely. From Davos to the BRICS meeting for One Belt One Road initiative summit just in May in Beijing, and once, twice, three times, and now the fourth time, China sounds like the global leader, not the United States. And Xi Jinping talk about cooperation, talk about infrastructure development, and talk about China's own reform. And also that in the recent party meeting, he emphasized that China, despite all these development, is still there's some imbalance and the issue areas that China should improve, particularly in the environment protection. So therefore, actually, in his speech today, he also talked about the environment protection in this area. Now, China, the most important thing is not what Xi Jinping said, but rather China's economy now is the second largest economy, and China's market is still huge. And also, I hope that China's neighboring countries and also Europe and North America should also learn from Africa and South America to see China as a part of solution, not of the just a part of the problem. I think that Xi Jinping's messages today just repeat what he said the previous 3 times, but now become a pattern. I think that's a pattern, that's a trend the United States should pay attention.
Very interesting what you just said, Mr. Polson. In fact, President Xi Jinping from China gave quite a number of deliverables during his speech this time. He talked about $2 trillion outbound investment and also $2 trillion investment into China's market, possibly by anyone from outside China. And he also talked about the first ever import expo China is going to host next year in Shanghai. All of these are very concrete deliverables. Do you think, though, the international community, the business sector, could function without the participation of the American government, the American administration? It seems that China gave a blueprint. People also want to jump on that wagon, but without America, can the rest of the world do it?
Yeah. Yes, the rest of the world can. It would be worse off for everybody, particularly for the U.S., but for China, for Europe, emerging Asia, if the U.S. goes down this isolationist, cowardly road. But it is just as the U.S.-led order functioned without China and without the Soviet bloc for decades. It would be an adjustment, but it can be done. And if China truly commits to rules and truly commits to opening up, as your previous speaker spoke about, in its own economic self-interest, there's no reason the world cannot continue. If anything, it will be the U.S. missing out on opportunities. I don't want to say it's golden that way. Many of the things you call deliverables, I think, frankly, are just symbols. Nobody's going to actually mobilize $2 trillion in a direct way. The expo is very nice. All kinds of countries have expos. What's really important that you've properly emphasized is President Xi's very deliverable commitment to staying within the WTO, the rules-based order, to opening up, to making globalization work for multiple countries. And the key phrase he used, open regionalism, which used to be what the U.S. advocated at APEC and was right, and it's right for President Xi to advocate that. So we can go on. We'll all be a little poorer for it, in the U.S. in particular, but the world can go on without the U.S.
Dr. Li, do you agree with that? Particularly if that were the case, it seems that the world is really experiencing something that is dramatic. A lot of different kinds of possibilities going to pop up when the U.S. really withdraws, at least for now, from some of the most important stages, economically particularly, trade particularly.
Well, I agree, but also I want to say that despite that, the delivery by the president certainly will not be well received in the region. I think American economy is still very, very dynamic. The U.S. is still the largest economy in the world. American business community certainly also will be very critical about some of the isolationist policy. Now, of course, on the trade issue, U.S. can express its concern and the fair trade and the rule-based development. But I think most importantly, we should really also understand the perspective of many other countries. And we should not bring everything to other countries. China certainly benefit from economic liberalization, but the United States also benefit from economic liberalization. And Xi Jinping at one occasion implied United States and China are 2 largest beneficiaries of economic liberalization. But the contrast today is just so overwhelming. So make people to be more concerned, not about China, but about the future direction, about the U.S. economy and the role, the leadership role of the United States in today's world. So that's a kind of a concern come from that meeting.
But at the same time, Mr. Tong, you see China not anymore reluctant to come to the center of the world stage, not anymore to strongly voice its own opinions and insights on some of the most critical issues of the world. But now China is really that much about so-called assuming the role of the leadership of the world. China do not necessarily want to have that title, or does it?
Yeah, you're right. I don't think China is going to be a player or leader in this game. China would like to share its achievements, after nearly 40 years of reform and development. China has become the second largest economy in the world, and China's political influence also, intensified in the world issues, in regional affairs. So I think this time China is facing such a challenge, whether we should be a leader of the world or just maintain the original player in this game. So China, I'm sure the leaders are having very clear vision toward the future. China will not be a dominant player in the future in regional affairs or economic development.
Right.
China would like to share, to have in a community of common destiny.
All right. Having said all of these strategic issues, let me also tap in some specific ones. Mr. Paulson, you see that President Trump just came out of what he termed as successful and fruitful trip to China. $250 billion deal signed by two sides, and today he was already accusing, quote unquote, some country of violating intellectual property rights. And also he said that the investigation was going on about those countries. So what do you think about the real nature of President Trump's belief when it comes to trade relations with China? Is this only temporary peace? Are we going to see much storm later?
I'm worried we're going to see much worse later. I think he decided, because he enjoyed and was impressed by the treatment he had and by President Xi, not to make a mess of things while in Beijing. I mean, it's like President Nixon, who would say terrible things about Mao and the Chinese government while pursuing a policy. You can do that, but it was the flip side of Nixon, in fact. But I think the important thing is linking it back to your previous set of comments, that China rightly doesn't want to have sole leadership. It's too soon, too much. It's also a system. But there also are legitimate complaints from the U.S., from Europe, from other wealthy countries about China. The way Trump has spoken about them exaggerates them, misunderstands them. But intellectual property rights, cybersecurity, the role of state-owned enterprise, subsidies in international trade, dumping of steel, these are all issues which should not be the cause of trade war or outright conflict. They should be the cause of negotiated solutions or rules-based solutions. But it means that this $250 billion, which is not real anyway, is just something that Trump can say to his voters, just like he said, oh, I'm going to save this Carrier air conditioning plant, which is being closed. So, that's not what this is about. It was a smart tactical move by the Chinese government. It's what Trump wanted, fine, but it doesn't mean much.
I see. Dr. Li, though, I mean, when you look at China and the United States, particularly in the speech given by President Trump when he's coming out of China, he praised particularly of Japan, for example. He also talked about the cultures in the region. He also made it very clear that U.S. want to develop something called the Indo-Pacific strategy without giving any interpretation about that specific phrase. Have you got any idea as to what it is?
Well, there's inconsistencies everywhere in the U.S. policy towards the region and towards economic development. So it's what you cited is absolutely right, but it's inconsistent. And this is probably attributed to two things. One is that some of his speeches actually prepared by his staff members, they still preoccupied the mood, Donald Trump's early mood for criticizing China. And out of the context, he just had a very successful trip to China in many ways on the personal level and also on the level that the Chinese leaders agreed to give her some gifts but also try to promote the openness and using Xi Jinping's word to make the cake bigger, so both countries can benefit. So, but he probably does not do a big homework to reflect what he just experienced in China. So we do not know whom he criticized when he talked about these trade countries and etc. Because he said, in China, he said that we should not blame China. So I think for the U.S. side, you need to see the consistency and the consistency between him and his bureaucracy and the consistency of himself. And but this makes the whole thing, his speech, just today, very, very confusing.
I see. Mr. Tang, my final question for you as well. You know, when the two presidents met in Beijing, they did not come out in a joint press conference, unlike previous plan. And we also heard their speeches here in Vietnam went very different directions.
Yeah.
And you didn't see the two presidents appear later meeting the APEC business leaders together either. So what can we expect really about the bilateral relations? Are we already reading some storm in the teacup at least?
No, I'm not.
Very briefly from you, sir.
No, I'm not so pessimistic about the future of the relation between China and the United States. Actually, during the summit in Beijing in recent 2 days, we have witnessed the great consensus between the two leaders. For example, the political cooperation in dealing with regional affairs, especially in terms of DPRK issue, and also the expansion of economic and trade cooperation. For example, during the early days, the trade actually mainly focused on the consumer goods, but now we are shifting the attention to the production goods. This is a very important and very big deal between the two countries, which should be a stabilizer for the relations between the two countries.
Teng Jianqun, Cheng Li, Adam Posen. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on today's program. This is going to be a big day if you look back in history, I guess, a few years from now. Thank you so much for joining us. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, our APEC special coming to you from Da Nang, Vietnam. Coming up later on our program, I speak exclusively with the Filipino Secretary for Trade and Industry to find out how his country is conducting regional integration. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Vietnam for the APEC special. Today is the final day of the APEC CEO Summit, and Philippine President Duterte's keynote speech he was delivered in Vietnam. He also urged members of the APEC to turn the Asia-Pacific into a comprehensively connected and integrated region. So how can the Philippines achieve that goal? Well, Philippines is holding the rotating presidency of ASEAN. Together with others, it is pushing forward the RCEP talks. Here, I sit down with the Filipino Secretary of Trade and Industry, Ramon Lopez, who offered his thoughts on the common goals that the Philippines and the other ASEAN members share. What kind of platforms are you going to work on?
Okay.
As the trade minister, of course, you're working on these discussions about TPP, RCEP on a constant basis.
Yeah.
But the deadline, that's what we're talking about. Where is the deadline? When is the deadline? How can we reach there?
All right. I guess talking of ASEAN, really the big thing there is the mega trade deal, which is called RCEP. And the RCEP, this regional integration discussions really take time. But it
was supposed to be the end of this year.
Not really. What we're saying by the end of this year is, I guess, more of substantial conclusion, and I think we're able to reach that by wherein all the participating countries, started by the ASEAN 10 member nations, agreed on what we call the key elements or the framework within which the so-called integration will be based on. So this talks about what % of your tariff lines will be liberalized, meaning to say you open it up, bring down to zero the tariff, how many sectors in the services, what will be the rules, economic cooperation, involvement of micro SMEs, things like those, investment agreements. So these things are part of the discussion, and the parameters in the discussion have been agreed on, at least this year. And moving forward, it's really just setting the final numbers, and hopefully in next year in Singapore or the year after, we will be able to come to a conclusion.
Yeah, but you know, even among ASEAN countries yourselves, there are a lot of differences because your economies are at very different development stages.
That's true.
So some wonder whether it is really the differences between the ASEAN countries and the 6 partners, or rather the real differences among the ASEAN economy that is preventing RCEP from really happening.
No, yeah, very good insight. Actually, we recognize the different levels of stages of development, and that is the reason why, to a certain extent, we apply the special and differential treatment, especially for the less developed economies that are part of ASEAN. And that goes, I guess, that principle goes to, as well as here in APEC, when we discuss globalization, I was mentioning about trying to make sure that globalization will be inclusive. And when we say inclusive, what real measures can we look at? And we are talking about making sure that the competencies in the small countries, the companies and micro SMEs in the small economies can really be improved. The competencies, capacity building, sharing of technology, best practices, big brother helping the small brothers. Activities in that regard that will bring education, training, mentoring, etc. It's really empowering those at the base of the pyramid.
Well, it sounds beautiful, but Mr. Minister, I have to say, your economies are also competing with one another.
That's right.
Because many of you are at the manufacturing stage, and you are competing for the market, you are competing for the technology, competing for the know-how.
That's true. But, you know, in competition and in globalization, this is the main principle, precisely. In the past, globalization is associated with winners and losers. Now we want to make everyone winners. And it just, you know, just like all the ships in a rising tide, everyone gets to win. But probably one will be a bigger winner than the others. But everyone, you know, in a globalizing world should result in everyone coming out as winners.
So what kind of timeline are we looking at when it comes to RCEP? You know, as journalists, we're always impatient. Yeah. What kind of time frame are we looking at, Mr. Minister?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I think if we agreed on this, since we agreed already on these key elements, and we have to translate them into the actual final numbers, that might probably be reached at next year. And then looking at the text and the legal scrubbing and all that, it might take another year. So realistically, we're talking of 2019. That's my estimate. If all these things can be wrapped up by next year, then that will be good.
As the rotating presidency of ASEAN countries, what do you think you need to fulfill eventually at the end of the year to make sure the RCEP, at least from your perspective?
We really have to really fine-tune the agreements on these key elements, the framework that everyone will agree to, and at least the ASEAN 10 member countries have agreed to that. And we just have to get the full agreement of the 6 other partner or dialogue countries.
I would assume that's a lot of pressure for you, Mr. Minister.
Yes.
Because you have to interact with all of them, trying to find our common grounds as much as possible.
And that is, I guess, that meeting that I'll have to go back to on November 12th. So I'll leave by Friday. Or sorry, I think Saturday, so that by Sunday we get really discussing. There will be an ASEAN economic ministers one day.
That's true.
Before the ASEAN leaders. So hopefully we can really wrap up these things in that meeting.
What is the role of China in RCEP from your perspective?
Oh, China plays a big role. It's one of the biggest economies, if not the biggest, when it comes to its participation. The 2 big economies in the 6 dialogue partners of ASEAN would be China and India. and then in China. The good thing, and we're very thankful that with the leadership of President Xi Jinping, he's taking the role of really the one driving for greater globalization. His policy towards globalization has been recognized among many countries nowadays, and we're very grateful for that. And I think China is also one example where it is trying to also to, just like what I was saying earlier, when you talk of globalization to be inclusive, one is you share best practices, you empower the small guys, as well as you open up market access to the small guys. It doesn't stop with just you know, words and rhetorics, but translate it into actual reforms. And market access is a big tool to use if you want really to help the small guys. So, and we see that in China nowadays, especially in the case of the Philippines, for example, given the renewed and stronger relationship of Philippines, led by our President Duterte, as he established also and strengthened the ties with the President Xi Jinping and the leadership of China, we realize a much greater market access for many of the Philippine products, as well as more investments coming into the Philippines and more tourists coming into the Philippines. So we're benefiting from that stronger relationship, and China is very generous in extending the help, even in our infrastructure build-up. They're doing a lot of participation.
What about the TPP?
I think for the TPP, given the exit of the United States, the TPP 11 are also committed to continue the TPP. And it is to our interest, we've registered our interest to look into potential participation of Philippines. As you know, we're not part of TPP. But of course, it will be very important for us, especially if U.S. will be back in the TPP. And it makes it compelling for us to participate. For now, of course, our focus is on RCEP. As you mentioned, it's really a challenge already to complete the RCEP. But as soon as we come to an agreement in RCEP, TPP would be the next big thing.
So you are thinking about it?
Oh, yes.
Coming back?
Yes. We're not part of that yet, but it is in our horizon to really consider joining TPP.
U.S. President Donald Trump, after the APEC leaders meeting, are going to the Philippines for a state visit. What can we expect from the Philippine side when it comes to the outcome?
Of course, the United States is a very big economic partner of ASEAN, one of the big dialogue partners, and definitely his role, meaning President Trump's role and policy direction towards increasing or strengthening the relationship with ASEAN member economies, as well as with the other dialogue partners, will be very critical. It depends on how open he will try to make arrangements with these other countries. That's very critical. We're excited. We're optimistic that U.S. has a strong sense of commitment ever since on globalization. They are one of the pioneers here. We believe that it is not something they just drop off.
How do you feel about the chemistry between President Trump and President Duterte? I mean, both of you are certainly very charismatic leaders.
Yes, we were very fortunate. Even the two leaders have started off very well in terms of their relationship through phone calls for now. It will be the first time that they will be meeting here in APEC. And we'll have a dialogue discussion, a bilateral meeting with the U.S. in Manila when President Trump joins ASEAN. And we're very optimistic because the two have gotten along very well since they met over the phone. I think both of them admitted that they are somehow at the same wavelength and the same character. Very strong political willed leaders.
Several balances probably the Philippines together with other countries that are dealing with the United States has to do. One is to balance the White House with the other branches of the government, given their internal debates. And secondly is to balance geopolitically for the Asia-Pacific region. There are different players, India, China, the United States, and some of the others. How do you, from the trade minister's perspective, look at these balances?
they have to play the relationship very well. Again, U.S. Moves would be very critical to the future of all these regions and their partners. But they are rational people. They have a rational leader, and the economy is one that will really spell a big difference in the lives of many people they're dealing with. For example, in the Philippines, the way we deal with the U.S., we're fortunate to have a GSP relationship on trade, and they allow, I think, over 3,500 items as part of that. We're also looking at the possible FTA with them, and that is the only way we can really strengthen the relationship.
What about that, the geopolitical thing? Do you, as the trade minister, have to think a lot about that too?
Of course, it has something to do with, it translates also to the economic relationship, you know. Countries' relationships must be maintained on a positive side.
At the point that when we're talking, the Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting with President Donald Trump of the United States. From the Philippines' perspective, as a trade minister particularly, what kind of relationship are you expecting?
I think the two leaders respect each other, and the two countries are very critical, the big economies of the world. They'll play a strong leadership role in the world economy, and I think their intention, while they would like to address their respective domestic concerns, is they have a high moral responsibility now of making sure that their relationship will be very sound, that will really would have a ripple effect on, you know, the other countries. So I think they recognize that very important role that the two economies, large economies, would have on the world. So I believe that they are rational leaders that will really think about how it will impact the other countries. So they'll make sure that their relationship will be strong.
There used to be times when territorial disputes and geopolitical reasons that have become the biggest challenge for China and the Philippines.
Okay, yeah.
How are we going to prevent that from happening again? And from the trade perspective, what can be done in order to contribute to the possibility on a better direction?
Yeah, you know, then it boils down to mutual respect for each other's sovereignty. The president has also made it clear that he values with high regard the commitment also of President Xi Jinping. When the two leaders discuss about the South China Sea, the West Philippine Seas, all these discussions. And the more important thing is that both leaders, even our president, is saying that issues that we cannot agree on for now, we put it aside. And we focus on where we can collaborate and cooperate. And that's the wisdom of our president, and as he discusses these things with the President Xi Jinping. The two leaders are very intelligent and really smart in agreeing to focusing on pursuing mutual economic cooperation and development. And that's the beauty that's happening right now. As our leader has mentioned, in due time, in the future, these issues may not be issues at all. That's when I heard him say that, that's...
What is your interpretation?
That to me is, I guess, a wisdom from an old person, an experienced person, a wise person. So it's really, because even if you talk of friends, two friends, two individuals, sometimes you have issue on a certain thing. But in the future, sometimes that issue is not as big as an issue.
Not relevant
in the
anymore.
future, and not as relevant as, you know, before.
But territory issues, I thought, is always relevant.
Of course. And that is where, of course, that I mentioned again, I go back to my first statement, the mutual respect for sovereignty. And how do we address that? How do we discuss that? Let's discuss. I mean, that to me, I guess, is the step moving forward. And to the extent that we can find a solution, good. If not, okay, let's park it and let's talk business.
The Filipino Secretary of Trade and Industry, our exclusive here in Da Nang, Vietnam. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone here in Da Nang, Vietnam, and back in the Beijing studio on World Insight team. Thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.